Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt the presence of someone who commanded absolute respect without uttering a single word? There's something almost magnetic about these individuals. They don't need to announce their authority, demand attention, or prove their worth through words. They simply exist in a space, and everyone instinctively recognizes their power. What if I told you that this mysterious quality isn't reserved for a chosen few, but is actually a psychological phenomenon that Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, spent decades studying? Jung discovered that true respect isn't earned through what we say, but through who we are at the deepest level of our being. Most people believe respect comes from achievements, titles, or the ability to speak persuasively. But Jung revealed something far more profound. The individuals who command the deepest respect are those who have done the sacred work of integrating their shadow, aligning with their authentic self, and radiating what he called psychological wholeness. They don't need to prove anything, because they've already proven everything to themselves. In the next few minutes, you'll discover the 5 psychological principles that allow certain people to command respect effortlessly. These aren't manipulation tactics or social tricks. They're profound truths about human psychology that, once understood and embodied, will fundamentally change how others perceive and respond to you. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand why some people can walk into any situation and immediately shift the energy without saying a word, while others can talk for hours and still struggle to earn basic respect. This isn't about becoming someone you're not. It's about becoming who you truly are. The first principle Jung identified is what he called the integration of the shadow. Picture 2 people entering a business meeting. The first person walks in with perfect posture, wearing expensive clothes, speaking confidently about their achievements. Yet somehow, everyone in the room feels slightly uncomfortable around them. There's something incongruent, something that doesn't quite align. The second person enters quietly, dressed simply, and says very little. Yet their presence fills the room with a sense of calm authority. Everyone naturally turns to them for guidance. What's the difference? The first person is operating from what Jung called the persona, the mask we wear to present ourselves to the world. They're trying to project an image of power, but unconsciously, they're radiating the energy of someone who hasn't faced their own darkness. Their shadow, all the parts of themselves they've rejected, denied, or buried, is still controlling them from the unconscious. Other people can sense this incongruence, even if they can't articulate it. The second person has done the difficult work of shadow integration. They've looked into the deepest, darkest corners of their psyche and made peace with what they found there. They've acknowledged their capacity for selfishness, their potential for cruelty, their hidden fears and insecurities. But instead of being destroyed by this knowledge, they've been liberated by it. When you own your darkness, it no longer owns you. And this ownership radiates outward as an unshakable sense of authenticity. Jung wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The person who has integrated their shadow no longer projects their unresolved issues onto others. They don't need to make others wrong to make themselves right. They don't need to diminish others to feel powerful. This creates a psychological safety that others can feel immediately. In their presence, people don't have to defend themselves or prove their worth. They can simply be. The psychological consequence of shadow integration is profound. When you're no longer at war with parts of yourself, you stop being at war with parts of others. You develop what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the ability to remain centered regardless of external circumstances. This sovereignty is felt by others as an unshakable strength, and it naturally commands respect. The second principle is the embodiment of what Jung called the transcendent function. the ability to hold opposites in creative tension without being torn apart by them. Most people live in psychological fragmentation, pulled between conflicting desires, values, and identities. They want to be strong but also vulnerable, confident but also humble, independent but also connected. This internal war creates external weakness. Consider the parent who can be both firm and loving simultaneously. They don't oscillate between being a tyrant and a pushover. They hold both authority and compassion in perfect balance. Children instinctively respect this kind of parent because they represent psychological wholeness. Or think of the leader who can make difficult decisions while maintaining genuine empathy for those affected. They don't see strength and kindness as opposing forces, but as complementary aspects of mature leadership. Jung discovered that the individuals who command the deepest respect are those who have learned to integrate their contradictions rather than being paralyzed by them. They can be both confident and curious, both decisive and flexible, both assertive and receptive. This integration happens through what he called the individuation process, the lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are rather than who you think you should be. The transcendent function manifests as an ability to remain calm in chaos, to find clarity in confusion, and to maintain inner peace regardless of outer turbulence. Others are naturally drawn to this quality because it represents something they unconsciously seek: psychological integration. In a world of fragmented people trying to present perfect facades, authenticity becomes magnetic. The spiritual consequence of embodying the transcendent function is that you become what Jung called a container for others' projections without being overwhelmed by them. People will project their hopes, fears, and unresolved conflicts onto you, but because you've integrated your own opposites, you can hold these projections with compassion rather than being triggered into reactivity. This creates a profound sense of safety and respect in others. The third principle involves what Jung termed the numinous presence, a quality that emerges when someone has connected with what he called the self, with a capital S. This isn't the ego self that most people identify with, but the deeper archetypal self that represents wholeness and transcendence. When someone embodies this connection, they radiate what can only be described as sacred authority. Imagine meeting someone who seems to carry the wisdom of ages in their eyes, not because of their chronological age, but because of their psychological depth. They don't need to tell you about their spiritual practices or philosophical beliefs. Their very presence communicates a connection to something greater than themselves. They speak from silence rather than from noise, and their words carry weight because they emerge from authentic depths rather than surface-level thinking. Jung observed that certain individuals seem to have access to what he called the collective unconscious, the deeper layer of the unconscious shared by all humanity. These people don't just speak from personal experience. They somehow tap into universal truths and archetypal wisdom. When they speak, others listen not just to their words, but to the deeper wisdom flowing through them. This numinous presence isn't mystical or supernatural. It's psychological. It emerges when someone has done the work of connecting with their deepest nature, beyond the conditioned patterns of personality and social expectations. They've learned to access what Jung called the wisdom of the unconscious, and this connection imbues their presence with a quality that others instinctively recognize as authentic power. The psychological consequence of developing numinous presence is that you become what Jung called a wounded healer. Someone whose own journey through darkness has given them the capacity to hold space for others' suffering without being overwhelmed by it. This quality naturally commands respect because it represents something rare in our world. Someone who has transformed their pain into wisdom rather than passing it on to others. Before we continue with the fourth principle, I want to acknowledge something profound that's happening right now. If you're still listening to these words, it means something in you recognizes the truth we're exploring. You're not just learning concepts, you're remembering something you've always known, but perhaps forgotten. The fact that you're drawn to understanding these deeper principles of human psychology suggests that you're ready for your own journey of psychological integration. If this resonates with you, consider subscribing to continue this exploration together, because what we're discussing isn't just theory, it's a roadmap for your own transformation. The fourth principle Jung identified is what he called energetic sovereignty, the ability to maintain your own psychological and energetic boundaries without having to defend them aggressively. Most people either have no boundaries and absorb everyone else's emotions and projections, or they build walls so thick that authentic connection becomes impossible. But those who command natural respect have learned something different: how to be completely open while remaining completely centered. Think of a tree standing in a storm. The tree doesn't fight against the wind, that would break it, but it doesn't surrender to the wind either, that would uproot it. Instead, it bends when necessary while maintaining its deep connection to the earth. This is energetic sovereignty, the ability to remain flexible in response to external pressures while never losing your essential core. Jung wrote extensively about what he called psychological contagion, the way emotions, fears, and unconscious patterns spread from person to person like viruses. Most people are completely unconscious of this process. They walk into a room full of anxiety and become anxious. They encounter someone's anger and become defensive. They meet someone's neediness and feel drained. But individuals who have developed energetic sovereignty have built what Jung called psychological immunity. They can feel what others are feeling without losing themselves in those feelings. This sovereignty manifests in subtle but powerful ways. When someone attacks them verbally, they don't immediately counterattack or collapse into victimhood. Instead, they remain present, curious about what's driving the attack, and responsive rather than reactive. When someone tries to manipulate them emotionally, they recognize the manipulation without becoming either angry or compliant. They simply remain centered in their own truth. The development of energetic sovereignty requires what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to feel difficult emotions fully without immediately trying to escape them, project them onto others, or act them out destructively. When you can hold your own pain with consciousness, you develop the capacity to hold others' pain as well. This creates a profound sense of safety that naturally commands respect. The psychological consequence of energetic sovereignty is that you become what Jung called psychologically immune to the unconscious manipulations and projections of others. You can't be pulled into their dramas, triggered into their patterns, or diminished by their attempts to make you smaller. This immunity isn't coldness or detachment. It's the warmth of someone who is so secure in themselves that they can afford to be genuinely present with others without losing themselves in the process. The fifth and perhaps most profound principle is what Jung called archetypal embodiment, the ability to connect with and express the deeper universal patterns of human experience. Every person carries within them what Jung called archetypes, universal patterns of human behavior and experience that transcend individual personality. Some people unconsciously embody the victim archetype, constantly attracting situations where they feel powerless. Others embody the eternal rebel, always fighting against authority. But those who command the deepest respect have learned to consciously embody what Jung called the integrated sovereign, the archetype of mature, conscious leadership. The integrated sovereign doesn't need to dominate others to feel powerful. Their power comes from their connection to something greater than themselves. They don't need to be right all the time because their sense of worth doesn't depend on being superior to others. They can admit mistakes, show vulnerability, and ask for help without feeling diminished. This paradoxical combination of strength and humility is what Jung identified as the hallmark of psychological maturity. Consider the difference between a dictator and a truly great leader. The dictator rules through fear, constantly defending their position against real and imagined threats. They can't show weakness because their entire identity depends on appearing invulnerable. The great leader, however, leads through inspiration. They don't need to prove their power because their power is self-evident. They can be vulnerable when appropriate, firm when necessary, and compassionate throughout. Jung discovered that archetypal embodiment happens naturally when someone has completed what he called the first half of life tasks, establishing an identity, developing competence, and finding their place in the world, and moved into the second half of life tasks, discovering meaning, developing wisdom, and serving something greater than themselves. This transition often happens around midlife, but it can occur at any age for those who are psychologically ready. The integrated sovereign archetype manifests as what Jung called natural authority that doesn't need to be claimed or defended, because it's simply an expression of who the person has become. Others recognize this authority instinctively and respond to it with respect, not out of fear or obligation, but out of recognition of authentic power. The psychological consequence of archetypal embodiment is that you become what Jung called a representative of the self, someone who embodies the highest potentials of human consciousness. Your very presence reminds others of their own capacity for growth, healing, and transformation. This is why certain people can command respect simply by walking into a room. They represent what Jung called the realized human being. But here's what Jung discovered that few people understand. All of these principles work together as an integrated whole. You can't simply adopt one or two and expect to command genuine respect. Shadow integration without energetic sovereignty leads to self-awareness without boundaries. Archetypal embodiment without the transcendent function leads to inflation and spiritual pride. The numinous presence without shadow work leads to false spirituality and unconscious superiority. Jung spent his entire career studying individuals who seemed to possess an almost magical ability to influence others without manipulation, to lead without domination, and to inspire without preaching. What he discovered was that these individuals had all, in their own way, completed what he called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature, the conscious effort to become more than what biology and conditioning alone would produce. This work is what Jung called individuation, not the development of individuality or uniqueness, but the integration of all aspects of the psyche into a functioning whole. It's the difference between being a collection of conflicting parts and being a unified being. It's the difference between reacting unconsciously to life and responding consciously from depth. The person who has undergone this process of individuation carries what Jung called psychological gold, the refined essence of human consciousness. They don't need to announce their value because their value is self-evident. They don't need to demand respect because respect flows to them naturally from those who recognize authentic being when they encounter it. This is why Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. When you become who you truly are, not the person your parents wanted you to be, not the person society expects you to be, not even the person you think you should be, but who you actually are at the deepest level. You naturally command the respect of others because you've already earned the most important respect of all, your own. But Jung also discovered something that might surprise you. The people who command the deepest respect are often those who care the least about being respected. This isn't indifference or arrogance, it's freedom. When your sense of worth comes from your connection to your authentic self rather than from external validation, you're free to be genuine rather than impressive, real rather than right, present rather than perfect. This freedom from the need for respect paradoxically makes you more respectable. Others can sense when someone is performing for approval versus when someone is simply being themselves. The performance, no matter how polished, always carries a subtle vibration of neediness. The authentic presence carries a vibration of completeness that others find deeply attractive. Jung observed that this transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's what he called a lifelong process that requires what he termed conscious suffering, the willingness to face difficult truths about yourself, to feel painful emotions without escaping into distraction or addiction, and to take responsibility for your own psychological development rather than expecting others to fix, complete, or validate you. The journey begins, Jung taught, with what he called the confrontation with the shadow, acknowledging and integrating the parts of yourself that you've been taught to reject or deny. This is often the most difficult part of the process because it requires admitting that you're capable of the very things you judge in others. But this admission is also the beginning of real psychological freedom. As you integrate your shadow, you naturally develop what Jung called psychological differentiation, the ability to distinguish between your own emotions and the emotions of others, between your own projections and reality, between your conditioned responses and your authentic choices. This differentiation creates the inner space necessary for genuine response rather than unconscious reaction. From this foundation of self-awareness and emotional sovereignty, you begin to access what Jung called the transcendent function. The ability to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible conflicts, to hold paradoxes without being torn apart by them, and to transform psychological energy rather than being overwhelmed by it. This leads naturally to what Jung described as the encounter with the numinous, moments of connection with something greater than the individual ego. This isn't necessarily religious or spiritual in a traditional sense, but it's always transformative. It's the recognition that you're part of something larger than yourself, while simultaneously being completely unique and irreplaceable within that larger whole. The final stage of this process is what Jung called the realization of the self. Not the ego self that most people identify with, but the archetypal self that represents wholeness, wisdom, and integration. When someone has realized this deeper self, they naturally embody what Jung called the authority of the realized human being. This authority isn't based on position, achievement, or social status. It's based on the depth of psychological work someone has done, the degree to which they've integrated their contradictions, and their capacity to remain connected to their authentic nature regardless of external circumstances. Others recognize this authority instinctively because it represents something they unconsciously seek, the possibility of becoming whole, of transcending the limitations of conditioning and fear, of living from authentic depth rather than surface-level reactivity. But here's the deepest truth Jung discovered about commanding respect. It's not ultimately about respect at all. The respect is simply a natural byproduct of psychological wholeness. When you're no longer fragmented within yourself, others naturally feel whole in your presence. When you're no longer at war with your own nature, others feel peaceful around you. When you're no longer trying to prove your worth, others naturally recognize your value. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the wounded healer. Someone whose own journey through psychological darkness has given them the capacity to hold space for others without being overwhelmed, triggered, or diminished. They've transformed their wounds into wisdom, their pain into compassion, their struggles into strength. The respect that flows towards such individuals isn't based on admiration for their achievements or fear of their power. It's recognition of their humanity, a humanity that has been refined through conscious suffering into something approaching what Jung called the gold of the human spirit. As we reach the end of this exploration, I want to leave you with Jung's most profound insight about respect and authority. True power comes not from having power over others, but from having power with others. It's not about dominance, but about presence. It's not about being better than others, but about being more yourself than you've ever been before. The individuals who command respect without saying a word have learned something that our culture desperately needs to remember. That authentic power is not something you take from others, but something you develop within yourself. It's not something you use against others, but something you share with others. It's not something that makes you separate from humanity, but something that makes you more deeply human. If you recognize yourself in this description, if something in these words resonates with a truth you've always known, but perhaps never articulated, then you're already on the path Jung described. The respect you seek from others is waiting for you on the other side of the respect you give to yourself. The authority you want others to recognize is waiting for you on the other side of your own self-authorization. The work begins now, in this moment, with the simple but profound decision to stop performing for approval and start showing up as authenticity. It continues with the courage to face what you've been avoiding about yourself, to feel what you've been numbing, to own what you've been projecting onto others. This is not easy work. Jung called it the most difficult task a human being can undertake, but it's also the most rewarding, because on the other side of this work is not just the respect of others, but something far more valuable: the deep, unshakable knowledge that you are exactly who you're supposed to be, exactly when you're supposed to be it, exactly where you're supposed to be. And from that place of radical self-acceptance, respect doesn't need to be commanded. It simply flows naturally, like water flowing downhill, toward the depth and authenticity you've worked so hard to cultivate within yourself. This is Jung's ultimate teaching about respect. It's not something you get, it's something you become.